For the last 9 weeks, we've been going through the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah and God's people returning to Jerusalem to rebuild, to be restored, and to reestablish God's people as a group. They weren't necessarily a sovereign nation anymore, but they were still God's people. But we get to close to the end of the book of Nehemiah, and the story is concluded, and then we find that one of the things they have to do is they have to populate the city of Jerusalem. They have to have people there, have people present in the city, because it was a very undesirable place to live. And on some level, it was undesirable because it put a target on your back, that no one wanted to live there because the enemy would focus on you. But also it was undesirable because it limited your financial opportunities. Land was more scarce as there were more people living there. The ability to spread out and have your own space was just not really there. And we find this in today's world of most people. We see that there is a rise in people living in cities. Rural areas are becoming smaller and cities are becoming bigger, and there's more and more. And what I find happens is as people, we kind of act like snow, that we kind of drift together. When you get to the end of June and you're getting in July, you start thinking about snow a little fondly, don't you? And realize that, that was nice, but come January, I'll think that was a foolish thought. But when you drive through the country after it snows, you can look out over the field and you can still see grass or the corn stalks sticking up, and there's not much snow there because the snow is all drifted together, has all accumulated in piles, whether it's next to trees or buildings or ditches or whatnot. We see that the snow naturally drifts. And I hope we realize that drifting is a real and constant danger for us, that it's real easy to drift. We're called to fix our eyes on Jesus and stay focused on Him. But if we're not careful, we will slowly go elsewhere, slowly assimilate to others, which is what happens time and time again through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah of God's people. They have this great enthusiasm, but then they just kind of drift a little bit and get off course. And so as we conclude the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in chapters 12 and 13, I'll pick up the story in 12:27 and kind of skip around a little bit. But at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, that's Nehemiah, had the leaders of Judah go up on the top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right. Ezra, the teacher of the law, led that procession. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall together with half the people. The 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God, and on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children had also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. At that time, the men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. From the fields around the towns, they were to bring into the storerooms portions required by the law for the priests and Levites. For Judah was pleased with the ministering priests and Levites. All Israel contributed to the daily portions for the musicians and gatekeepers. They also set aside the portion of the other Levites, and the Levites set aside portion for the descendants of Aaron. So at this moment, we find that the wall is completed. The story had already alluded to the completion of the wall, but now it's specifically mentioned. When God's people first returned, they started by building the temple. And they built the house of the Lord, the temple, the place of worship. And then finally when Nehemiah came, they built the walls around the city of Jerusalem, restoring it. And it had taken almost 100 years from when they first entered Jerusalem to when Nehemiah was able to help them complete the wall. And so it was a big celebration. They honored God and gave Him glory and praise for all that He allowed them to do. And this dedication that they had showed that the wall was sturdy. If you remember, earlier Nehemiah in chapter 4, God's people are starting the process of rebuilding the wall, and Sanballat and Tobiah are making fun of them. They're mocking them, saying that the work is being done quickly. And they say, well, you can't do work quickly like that and it be sturdy. And Tobiah actually says that a single fox, if they set foot on the wall, would knock it down. That's how flimsy they were saying the wall was, but the work was done. The wall was sturdy, and God's people saw how God provided. That the two large choirs were walking around on top of the wall. It was sturdy, it was strong. But no matter the sacrifice we make, no matter how much effort we put forth, no matter what we give, we have to always recognize that it belongs to God. It's not mine. It's not ours. The celebration, the glory, the honor is God. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were present, and both Ezra and Nehemiah were officials in Persia. They were kind of bigwigs, had some clout there. And so when you think about what was happening here, there was this big celebration, big procession, just big event. But it probably didn't compare to some of the things they experienced in Persia, in the capital with the king, and all this big pomp and circumstance. It didn't compare to the worldly effect that they experienced in Persia. But they recognized that what they were experiencing was something deeper. It wasn't the king with all these resources that they were celebrating. It was God. It was the Lord. It was the reason they were there. It wasn't because they were worshiping King Artaxerxes of Persia. They were worshiping the God of the universe. But after this happened, after the celebration, Nehemiah returns to Persia. He was the cupbearer, and which essentially meant that he had to taste the drink and food before he ate it, so the king wasn't poisoned. But he was an advisor. He was a confidant to the king, and so the king wanted him back. And he had to come back, and when he did, the people began to drift. They got off course. And I'm not sure how many of you enjoy to fish and to be outdoors in that type of setting. But I've been fortunate enough to be bass fishing before, and it's fun. It can be frustrating, specifically bass fishing. Sometimes fish don't bite in general. But one of the things about boats is that in almost every situation, a boat will always drift. There may be a few extreme situations where on a pond with zero wind that day and the boat doesn't drift, but almost every situation, the boat will naturally drift. Now, obviously, when we're talking about something like the Mississippi River, I don't know if that's called drifting. That's just the current. But I'm talking about when you're in a still setting, whether the ocean or a lake or some still body of water, the boat will still drift. So when you're out something like bass fishing, they have this thing called a trolling motor that goes on the front of the boat. And I've never driven one. I've just seen it used. And part of the premise here is that it's quiet, so it won't scare the fish, but it allows the fisherman, the person in the boat, to drive the boat with their feet so that they can continue to find prime fishing spots and not get caught in different areas, because the boat will drift. Unless it's anchored, unless you are moving with a purposeful direction, the boat will drift somewhere else. And God's people drifted while Nehemiah was away. And they realized it at times, but that Nehemiah had to come and clean it up. Because we find in chapter 13, that the book of Moses was read aloud, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all whom were foreign descent. Before this, Eliashib, the high priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the offerings and tithes. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put them back into the equipment of the house of our God. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back into their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their post. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. So Tobiah was given space in the temple. And if you remember, Tobiah was an enemy of what God's people were doing. He specifically and intentionally tried to thwart the plans of Nehemiah. It's not as though he was indifferent. It's not as though he was just doing his own thing. He specifically and intentionally tried to get in the way of what Nehemiah was doing. And I was trying to think of what would this equate for us today, of the church allowing certain people to use our building. And on some level, I was like, well, maybe this is like allowing a drug dealer to set up shop in our building. Now I would say, though, most drug dealers don't really care about the church. Most drug dealers are not purposefully working to try to stop what the church is doing. The drug dealer's doing his own thing. They're not getting in the way. So as I was thinking about it, and it's more than just somebody from a different religion using the building, because people in different religions can function harmoniously. We can have at least functional relationships. And as I think of what's happening here, Tobiah was a leader, a politician essentially. And when we think about politicians, we have to be real careful with how the church connects itself to the government. Because it can be real easy to connect yourself with the government when they're doing you favors. And so that's what was happening here, is that when Tobiah got in cahoots with the leaders here and the temple, all of a sudden Tobiah was giving them favors. When they started giving Tobiah favors, he started giving them favors, and so they began to compromise their integrity. They gave him a place in the temple for him to set up shop. And it was Eliashib was the issue. Now in chapter 3 of Nehemiah, he is one of the workers. He is given commendation for being somebody who is putting forth effort. But now, as the priest, he has allowed a major compromise to happen. And on some levels, he is seen as a traitor. And we find that his grandson is married to Sanballat's daughter. Now, Tobiah and Sanballat were the two biggest antagonists in the book of Nehemiah, of trying to stop what God was doing. So Eliashib was connected to these people. And it shows the danger of fraternizing with the enemy, of how when we get close to them, when we tie ourselves to those who don't want God's purposes fulfilled, then it can easily pull us away from what God wants us to do. But Eliashib, as I said, he was one of those original workers. He's one of those people who's putting forth extreme effort. But it all comes back to the recognizing that this belongs to God. It's not mine. Because a lot of people can sit here and say, well, my grandpa built this church, so I'm entitled. So whatever. It's not your grandpa's building. It's God's building. It's not your parents' ministry. It's not yours. It's God's. And when we start taking ownership in a way that pulls it from God, then we have not made it what God has called it to be. Now, we need to take ownership, and we need to put forth effort. We need to own it in the sense that we take responsibility, but we can't take ownership in that it literally and physically belongs to us. Because God's people were not supporting the temple as they promised. Before Nehemiah left and went back to Persia, they had committed an oath to financially support the temple, the ministry that God was doing. You know the reason the storeroom could be given to Tobiah? Because it was empty. If God's people had sacrificially given and filled that temple with what they should have been doing, there would have been no room for Tobiah. When God's people start pulling away from God, there's room for other things. And that becomes a major problem. See, spiritual lapses are almost always seen in our finances. So I wonder, are your finances sanctified? Are your finances fully given to God? Or are they kind of partially, or maybe not at all? See, drifting is the default destination. We will naturally drift unless we radically keep our eyes fixed upon Jesus. We will naturally be pulled away from him. And so because the people were being pulled away from Jesus, there was room for non-God things in the temple. Because they were being pulled away from him, other things creeped into their life. So the religious leaders, they went back to work in the fields. Well, we're not getting supported as we are supposed to be, so they went back in their fields, which meant they neglected their spiritual responsibilities. Now, Nehemiah, as we've seen, he's a pretty bold leader. He's a pretty take-charge leader. So he saw what's happening, and I almost get the picture of he saw those religious leaders. He grabbed them by the ear and said, this is where you're supposed to be. Get back to your religious responsibilities. Quit going out there. I'm going to handle those people. I'm going to make sure you have what you need, but stay where God has put you. That's how he handled things, and he went and he brought them back. And as I think about Nehemiah, the people had already responded a little bit to the rebuke. They saw the law was read that the Ammonites and Moabites should not be there, and so they took care of that, but they just didn't get quite far enough. They didn't go exactly as far as God wanted them to be. But because Nehemiah's leadership, because he brought to light what the people were supposed to do, all of a sudden people are bringing their tithes. People are supporting the temple as they were supposed to. We have to come to grips with the reality that if we reject conviction, if we reject confrontation, then really we're rejecting God's love. Because God doesn't bring conviction in our life just to make us feel bad. He brings conviction in our life so that we repent and then he can heal us. That is his goal. God's goal is not so that you just feel bad. It's that you stop this drifting mentality. That you get back to where you want to be. Now, there are water parks. And at most water parks, they have this concept called the lazy river. Now, growing up, I just thought I couldn't wrap my mind around why anybody would want to participate in the lazy river. You just sit there and you float. Someone who burns easily, that was not appealing at all. If I'm going to be out in the sun, I'm going to be productive. I'm going to do something fun with that. Now that I'm older, I can say, sometimes it's nice just to hang out there and sit there. But as I think about the lazy river, I wonder how many times that's what we do in life. Oh, we just, I'm just going to sit here. I'm just going to let the current take me. I'm not going to live a purposeful life. I'm going to live a life that just kind of drifts away. And you know what eventually happens? Is you're going to get burned. That if we go through life just drifting, we're going to end up in a place of fire and a place of glory. We're going to the wrong direction, and that's where God's people were going. That's where they were drifting. And we continue in verse 15. Nehemiah continues to speak. In those days I saw the people of Judah treading winepress on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all the kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath. I rebuked the nobles and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same thing, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Remember me for this, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. So God's people were working on the Sabbath. Not working on the Sabbath, taking a Sabbath is a very radical concept. And in the ancient world, no one else besides God's people had any kind of concept like this. But they were working as though it was normal, as though this is what you should do. Regardless of what it is, whenever sin is identified, it must be confronted head on. We can't stop. We can't just allow it to linger. We can't tolerate it. Now, it does bring the question, was Nehemiah being legalistic about this approach? When we recognize the grace that is embedded in God's law, then I think we recognize that it's not being legalistic, because honoring the Sabbath, taking the Sabbath, is not just about sitting on the couch and taking a nap. It's about resting in God's presence. And I don't think you can legitimately and authentically rest in God's presence while being legalistic about it. Because when you're being legalistic about it, then you are missing the presence that God has for you. But Nehemiah recognized that the Sabbath was important, that it was intended to protect God's people and draw God's people closer into who God was. So Nehemiah's concern here was for God's people, for their spiritual health. But one of the things we find, whether we're talking about Nehemiah's time, whether we're talking about our today's time, we're real good at finding loopholes. We're real good at finding ways around the actual requirements. Because what was happening here is that there were certain people that were trying to be pious, or at least look like they were doing the religious responsibility, but yet they found ways around it. So there were business leaders who they themselves were not working on the Sabbath, but they had employed those who were not part of God's people, some Gentiles, some people from Tyre, who were working on the Sabbath, so that their business could still make a profit. So while I'm not working on the Sabbath, my company's still making money, but I'm not working on the Sabbath. And Nehemiah puts a stop to that. He said, any loophole that we find around God's law is not worth it. It just distorts God's intention for us in a way that's not healthy, in a way that's not good, in a way that just pulls us away from who God is. So he puts a stop to it. He locks the gates. He not only tells people to stop, he puts something in place to remove the temptation. It's real tempting for us when we have sin in our lives to go privately to God and say, God, please forgive me, and then we move on with life without putting any safeguards in place to protect us from that temptation again. Nehemiah saw this temptation, saw the sin, said, stop it, and I'm going to do something about it to prevent us from being tempted. Now, he was pretty rough. There were some details in this part of the story that I didn't read. He was pretty rough. I would encourage you to read all of chapter 13. But he's pretty rough in making sure that this was kept, the Sabbath was kept, because he knew drifting is the default destination. We naturally drift. We naturally go away from God. But there is no sacrifice too great when we're talking about our spiritual health. We're talking about our spiritual life and our spiritual connection with God. Because constant vigilance is required to make sure we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. If we don't, we're going to drift. We're going to pull away, and then other things start creeping into our lives that don't honor God. Now, if I've been fortunate a few times to go into the ocean, and I've swam in the ocean a few times, and it's fun. I've never been in a dangerous situation or anything like that. But I have become aware of the current of the ocean. Now, if you go out in the ocean, if you swim or you play catch or something like that, if you're out in the ocean for any period of time, and then you look up at the shore, you'll notice that you've moved. That it depending on the part of the ocean where you are, will impact how quickly you're moving. But I am always amazed that I'll look up and be like, well, I'm several hundred feet from where I started. And part of the issue is that there's no point of reference when you're in the water to keep you focused on where you're supposed to be. But part of it is the current just subtly moves you without you recognizing it. But then we get to the kind of the extreme case scenario when we're talking about riptides. Now, I've never been caught up in a riptide, thankfully. But one of the things about riptides they tell you is don't try to swim against it. If you get caught up in a riptide, it's trying to take you out into the water, deep in the ocean. If you try to swim straight to the shore, you're not going to be successful. The riptide's going to be too strong. So they actually tell you that you need to swim parallel to the shore until you can get out of the riptide, and then you can safely come back to shore. And as I think about that, I think sometimes we fight against sin so much, we fight and fight and fight against it when Jesus says you got to take the long way to get out of it. You want to try to fight through it, but you can't beat it yourself. So you got to swim parallel to the shore so that you can then get out of that temptation. You got to remove yourself from that temptation, from that setting, before you can be free from it. So Nehemiah closed the gates. He stopped it. He removed that temptation. He got people out of the riptide so that they wouldn't be tempted to drift and be pulled away more from God. But he concludes the story in verse 23. He said, I saw the men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or one of the language of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them, beat some of the men, and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or yourselves. Was it not because of marriages like this that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made a king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. We must hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties to each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times for all the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God. So this is the third time that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah have specifically addressed marriage to this intensity. And intermarriage was prevalent, and we always have to be careful that we're not talking about racial superiority or anything of that nature. It's not about race or ethnic. It's about spiritual direction, that the people that they were intermarrying with were not serving God, or Yahweh is what they would refer to as. The people were serving other gods. And so they had these competing worldviews that were coming together in a marriage and trying to figure it out. And what would happen at a minimum is that both sides would compromise. And when you compromise when you're talking about your faith, then you have opened the door for evil and sin to creep into your life. And that is what Nehemiah is confronting here. There are many instances in the Old Testament. Ruth is a prime example of someone who was outside of God's people, who because she forsake her pagan upbringing, she became part of God's people. She entered it because she declared allegiance to Yahweh. But each generation seems to be having the same sin that they have to confront. And they have intermarriage with Tobiah and Sanballat, and their families are connected to God's people because of marriage. God's people have tied themselves to those who want nothing to do with God. Like always, Nehemiah deals with sin head on. Whatever sin that he's confronting, he recognizes that it's a perpetual problem, that these sins are not good, that he can't play nice with them. And so he confronts them, and he rebukes people. Sin needs a radical cure. It's not something that we can just deal nicely with. We've got to be mean and vicious with it because it requires constant vigilance. Without constant vigilance, we're going to drift, because that is what we will naturally do. We need to separate ourselves completely from sin. But as Nehemiah does all of this stuff, especially as he gets Tobiah out of the temple, on some levels, Nehemiah is foreshadowing Jesus and the purification that Jesus is bringing to us. You know the story, every gospel includes it, but John chapter 2, when Jesus clears the temple. And it's just this moment where we see that, Jesus means business. Throughout Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're called to build it, and if you build it, what will God do? We see that they're building a temple. They built the altar, they built the temple, they built the walls. But there was something deeper that they were doing, and whether they recognized it or not. As I said, Nehemiah was foreshadowing Jesus, but he was also preparing the people for Jesus. See, those walls that were there, that temple that was there, those were the same walls and temple that Jesus walked through. So he was preparing Jerusalem to receive the Messiah, to receive the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He was preparing Jerusalem for Jesus, which is what we're called to do. If you build it, what are we building? We are building a community that is working to prepare the world for Jesus. That is our mission. So we look at Ezra and Nehemiah, and it took them 100 years to get back and build a building and build a wall. And it wasn't even that big of a building. It wasn't even that big of a wall. But it took them almost 100 years because they drifted, because they got off course, because they got distracted, because they had spiritual issues that they weren't dealing with. But through all that, even though they were imperfect, God didn't excuse their imperfection, but God still was able to shine through and send His Messiah through their imperfection. And so this morning, today, we are the church. We are the body of Christ. And our mission is not to sit here and just wait till heaven comes. Our mission is to go prepare the world for Jesus. Our mission is to leave, to go, to be a sent people, not just waiting, but people that are going, that are proclaiming, that are sharing, that are giving victory, that are bringing glory and praising the name of Jesus in this world today. Drifting is our default destination, but we don't have to. I'm reminded in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, Jesus is on the road to Emmaus, and he interacts with these guys who they don't recognize him. And they have some back and forth. They eventually invite him into their home, and they have a meal together. And when Jesus breaks the bread, their eyes were open, and they saw Jesus. That's what the church needs, more than anything. We need to have our eyes open so we can see Jesus.